To understand the Imperium of Man in the 41st millennium is to understand a single, terrifying truth. It is an empire of faith, a theocracy built on the worship of a single, divine being. But what if I told you that this entire galaxy-spanning religion is founded on a heresy? Not just any heresy but the very first and greatest one, the worship of a man who explicitly forbade it. This is the story of the Adeptus Ministorum, the Imperial Ecclesiarchy. And it begins not with a revelation but with a rebellion. In the beginning, during the Great Crusade, the Emperor of Mankind enforced a doctrine known as the Imperial Truth. It was a creed of cold, hard logic and absolute atheism. Its goal was to liberate humanity from the perils of superstition and the corrupting dangers of the warp. To worship the emperor as a god was not just misguided, it was an act of sedition. Yet, in the shadows, a forbidden text began to circulate, the Lectitio Divinitatis. Authored by the Primarch Lorger of the Word-Bearers after he witnessed the emperor's power, it was the first document to systematically argue that the emperor was not just a man, but a god in flesh and blood. This book became the bedrock of every future imperial cult, a sacred text born from a traitor. But how did this banned belief survive? The Horus heresy was the catalyst. The emperor's near-fatal wounding and interment within the Golden Throne were not seen as a tragedy by believers, but as a divine ascension, his ultimate sacrifice for humanity. In the anarchy that followed, countless cults sprang up across the ruined Imperium, all worshipping the emperor, each with its own variations. The most powerful of these was the Temple of the Savior Emperor. Its founder was a respected Imperial army officer who had fought at the Siege of Terra. Renaming himself Fatidicus, he began to preach, and his message of hope and reunification through faith in the divine emperor spread like wildfire through the traumatized ranks of the Imperial Guard and Navy. The journey from a single cult to the state religion was a brutal one. The timeline of its rise to power is a story of consolidation and conquest. To understand the Imperium of Man as it exists in the 41st millennium, one must first understand the genesis of its soul, the Adeptus Ministorum, the state church. Its birth was not a peaceful one, but a consequence of catastrophe and a testament to humanity's need for a savior. It began, as all things do, with the Horus heresy and the emperor's ascension to the Golden Throne at the close of the 31st millennium. This was not merely a political schism or a failed rebellion, it was a spiritual cataclysm. The emperor, who had always denounced faith and worship, was broken and entombed. In his sacrifice he became the very thing he fought against, a god in need of supplicants. The people of the Imperium, reeling from the betrayal and terror, looked upon his silent, enduring form and saw not a failed secular leader, but a divine protector who had given his all to shield them. This was the catalyst. The imperial truth was a corpse, the imperial cult was its ghost, born from the need to give meaning to unparalleled suffering. From this fertile ground of grief and devotion sprang the Temple of the Savior Emperor in the early 32nd millennium. It was one of countless cults vying for prominence in those chaotic years, but it possessed a ruthless clarity of purpose. It did not seek to debate or coexist with its rivals. It absorbed them, assimilating their rituals and symbols, or it destroyed them. Its doctrine was simple, potent, and spread like a fever. Worship the God Emperor, for he is our only salvation. It offered certainty in an uncertain galaxy, and through zeal and force, it became the dominant voice of mankind's faith. This burgeoning power could not be ignored by the secular state. In a move of profound consequence, the temple was officially recognized as the imperial state religion. It was formalized, given structure, and renamed the Adeptus Ministorum. This was a pivotal moment. The church was now a formal pillar of the Imperium, a separate entity from the imperial government, yet inextricably bound to it. The state now had a soul, and the soul now had the authority of the state. But the final piece of the puzzle, the moment the church's authority became truly supreme, came in the mid-32nd millennium. Ecclesiarch Venerus II was granted a permanent seat on the Senatorum Imperialis, the Council of the High Lords of Terra. With this, the ecclesiarchy was no longer just an influential institution. It was now at the very heart of political power. The Ministorum could now shape imperial law, command armies, and dictate the fate of worlds, not just through faith, but through direct decree. Thus, from a catalyst of sacrifice to a dominant cult, to a formal state religion, and finally to a seat of ultimate political power, the ecclesiarchy was forged. It is a testament to a simple, unyielding truth, that in the grim darkness of the far future, to control the hearts of men is to control the Imperium itself. But no faith becomes monolithic without eliminating its competition. The only serious rival to the emerging ecclesiarchy was the Confederation of Light, a sect based on Dimimar that preached poverty and humility, directly contradicting the opulent, powerful temple. The ecclesiarchy's response was not with theological debate, but with fire and sword. With the blessing of the High Lords, they launched the First War of Faith, unleashing the Imperial Guard and fanatical Fraterist militia upon the Confederation, all but wiping it out. The path to absolute power was now clear. So, by the 33rd millennium, the transformation was complete. The Imperium was a theocracy. Every world had its cathedrals, and the coffers of the ecclesiarchy overflowed with the tithes of trillions of faithful. A man who despised gods had become one, and his church now held absolute spiritual and political sway over the destiny of humanity. But what happens when a religion built on absolute faith is led by a man with absolute ambition? The answer would nearly shatter the Imperium forever, in an era known as the Age of Apostasy. Now, we must understand the machine of that faith. By the 41st millennium, the Adeptus Ministorum is not a simple church. It is a vast, bureaucratic and militant organization, as complex and rigid as the Adeptus Administratum itself. To comprehend its influence, we must look at its structure, its core beliefs, and the very tools it uses to enforce its will. At the very top sits the ecclesiarch, a permanent High Lord of Terra, who rules from the immense cathedral of the Holy God Emperor on Terra. Beneath him is the conclave of cardinals, who oversee the 5 main administrative branches of the Ministorum. But the true power of the Church lies in its decentralization. Each cardinal rules a segment of space, and beneath them are the bishops and confessors who govern individual worlds and star systems. The Missionaria Galaxia is one of the most vital arms. These are the missionary priests who travel to newly discovered or non-compliant worlds, tasked with spreading the imperial creed, often by any means necessary. They are the sharp tip of the faith's spear. So, what is the imperial creed? What does every citizen, from the highest noble to the lowest hive scum, believe? First and foremost, the God Emperor is the one true deity. He is the master of mankind, who watches over and protects all of humanity from the terrors of the warp. Second, the Emperor's sacrifice is central. He suffered and was entombed on the golden throne for the sake of all mankind. This act of eternal vigil is the ultimate symbol of his love and protection. Third, aliens, mutants, and heretics are the enemy. They are impure, a blasphemy against the human form created by the Emperor, and must be purged. And finally, a more recent and terrifying addition. The Imperial Cult is the only path to salvation. To deny the Emperor's divinity is heresy, and the punishment for heresy is death. But faith alone did not build this empire. It required force. And the most famous and feared instrument of the ecclesiarchy are the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle. Founded in the aftermath of the Age of Apostasy under the Decree Passive, which forbade the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms, the Sisters of Battle became the Church's militant arm. They are not men. They are a loophole of faith and fury. They are divided into specific orders. The orders militant are the battlefield warriors, the ones who chant war hymns as they purge the unclean with bolter and flame. The orders hospitaller serve as medics and healers, though they are still formidable warriors. The orders dialogus are scholars and translators, seeking to understand ancient texts and Xeno's languages to better combat them. The orders famulus act as diplomatic agents in noble households, ensuring the loyalty of the imperial aristocracy. And we must not forget the fraterist militia, ragtag hordes of common citizens whipped into a religious frenzy and sent into battle as temporary crusaders. They are the expendable fist of the Ministorum, a reminder that faith can be a weapon as deadly as any bolt gun. This structure and these tools all serve one purpose: to maintain absolute control. The Ministorum's influence is inescapable. It is the local priest who records your birth and your death. It is the confessor who hears your doubts and reports your heresies. It is the Schola Progenium that indoctrinates the orphans of imperial officials into fanatical servants of the state and church. The Adeptus Ministorum is the glue that holds the Imperium together, and the cage that keeps its citizens in line. It provides hope in a universe of horror, and fear in a universe of doubt. But what happens when this immense power is concentrated in the hands of a single, corrupt individual? The entire system would be bent to his will, leading to the darkest chapter in the Church's history, the Age of Apostasy. We have seen the birth of the faith and the machinery of its power. Now we descend into the period that nearly broke it forever. This is the story of how the ecclesiarchy, the very soul of the Imperium, became its greatest predator. This is the age of apostasy. Our story begins with a man named Goj Van Dyer. A former scribe in the Administratum, Van Dyer was a genius of bureaucracy and a monster of ambition. He saw the decaying machinery of the Imperium and knew how to seize its levers. Through blackmail, manipulation, and political maneuvering, he rose to become the master of the Administratum, giving him control over the Imperium's vast bureaucracy. But his true masterstroke was getting himself elected as the ecclesiarch, the head of the Adeptus Ministorum. For the first time in history, the secular and religious power of the entire Imperium was concentrated in the hands of one man. Van Dyer now controlled both the body and the soul of humanity's empire. He declared himself the Grand Master of the Adeptus Ministorum and Master of the Administratum, and his rule, known as the Reign of Blood, began. Van Dyer's regime was one of unparalleled paranoia and brutality. He used the Ministorum's doctrine to paint himself as the Emperor's sole, divinely chosen representative. To question him was to question the God Emperor himself. His primary instrument of terror was the Fraterus Templar, a massive crusade fleet and army comprised of Fraterus militia and fanatical Imperial Guard regiments, which he used to purge any world that showed the slightest dissent. But his most personal and terrifying enforcers were the brides of the Emperor, later known as the Daughters of the Emperor. This was a sisterhood of fanatical women who served as Van Dyer's personal bodyguards and executioners. They were utterly loyal, believing they were serving the Emperor directly through Van Dyer. They were led by a woman named Arabella, and their most infamous member was a prodigiously skilled fighter known simply as Muriel Sabathiel. For 70 years the Imperium bled. Entire planetary populations were slaughtered for imagined slights. The Ministorum became an engine of tyranny, its scriptures twisted to justify Van Dyer's madness. It seemed nothing could stop him. He had the army, the faith, and the bureaucracy. But his downfall would come from the very heart of his power. The end began with two separate journeys. The first was that of Sebastian Thor, a humble preacher from the world of Dimimar. After witnessing the horrors of Van Dyer's rule, Thor began to speak out, sparking a populist uprising known as the Confessor Movement. His rhetoric was not one of atheism but of a purification of the faith, a return to a creed that served the people, not a megalomaniac. His rebellion grew into a full-blown crusade, the Thorians, who began to systematically liberate worlds from Van Dyer's grip. The second journey was that of a deputation from the Adeptus Mechanicus Forge world of Mars. Concerned about the instability Van Dyer was causing, they traveled to Terra to speak with him directly. They were refused an audience for years. But when they were finally granted access to Van Dyer's inner sanctum, they witnessed something shocking. There stood Van Dyer in a room with the Daughters of the Emperor, ranting and raving, a long flowing robe obscuring the fact that he had not put down his powered sword, the blade of the unicorn, in decades. The leader of the Mechanicus delegation, Archmagos Kala Mensha, immediately understood the madness before him. He turned to the leader of the brides, Arabella, and simply said, "He has played you for fools." He showed them that Van Dyer's blade was not a relic but a weapon, and that the man they protected was a raving lunatic. This revelation shattered the faith of the daughters. In that moment their fanatical loyalty broke. As the story goes, Arabella and her sisters turned on Van Dyer. The very bodyguards he trusted above all else dragged him from his throne and beheaded him, ending his life and his reign in a single brutal stroke. With Van Dyer dead, Sebastian Thor emerged as the hero of the Imperium. He was offered the position of ecclesiarch but refused. Instead, he presided over the Council of Thor, which established the reforms that would prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. The most important of these was the Decree Passive. This law forever separated the Adeptus Ministorum from the arms of the imperial state. The ecclesiarchy was forced to disband its massive Fraterus Templars and was forbidden from maintaining men under arms. But as we know, the Church is adept at finding loopholes. The decree said men. And so, the existing orders of the Daughters of the Emperor were reformed, rearmed, and renamed. They became the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, the Church's new and entirely legal militant arm. The age of apostasy was a self-inflicted wound that nearly killed the Imperium. It proved that the greatest threat to humanity could come from within, from a corruption of its own faith. It created the Sisters of Battle as we know them today, and it established a fragile balance of power that persists into the 41st millennium. The mini-storm had survived its own worst excesses. But the galaxy is a vast and dangerous place. How would this reformed but still immensely powerful institution fare when faced with external threats and internal schisms? The faith would be tested again in fire and in blood. We have traversed the birth, structure, and greatest internal crisis of the Adeptus Ministorum. But history is not merely a record of the past, it is the blueprint for the present. Now, we synthesize these elements to see how the Ministorum actually functions in the 41st millennium. We will see how its dogma, forged in heresy and reformed in blood, is applied as a practical tool for control, conquest, and survival. Consider the Missionaria Galaxia, the Church's missionary arm. Its goal is absolute, to bring every human world into the light of the Imperial Creed. But how it achieves this is a masterclass in applied dogma. On a primitive world where the sun is worshipped as a god, the Missionaria priest doesn't eradicate this belief. He subverts it. He proclaims that the sun is merely a creation of the god emperor, a symbol of his light and power. The native sun god becomes a facet of the emperor, their rituals are absorbed into Imperial Cult practices, and their priests are re-educated into the Ministorum's hierarchy. This is the soft power of the creed. It is adaptable and absorptive, capable of digesting local cultures to fuel its own expansion. But when a world openly resists, or worse, worships a Xenos entity, the hard power is unleashed. The Missionaria does not come alone. They accompany Imperial Guard regiments, or, if the heresy is grave enough, the Sisters of Battle. The sermon becomes an ultimatum. Conversion is followed by a tithe of psychers for the Astronomicon and manpower for the Guard. The Missionaria doesn't just save souls. It actively recruits bodies and resources for the Imperial war machine. Faith and logistics are two sides of the same coin. The Adeptus Sororitas are the living embodiment of the decree passive in action. They are the solution to the problem of, how does the Church wield force without breaking its own laws? But their application goes far beyond mere bodyguards. During the Plague of Unbelief, a massive rebellion in the Segmentum Obscurus led by the corrupt Cardinal Bucarus, it was the Sororitas who formed the core of the Loyalist forces. They were the unbreakable, fanatical spearhead that broke Bucarus's heretic armies. This event proved that the Sisters were not just a ceremonial force. They were a vital strategic asset that could be deployed to quell internal threats too great for the Imperial Guard, especially those with a religious dimension. Their role is also doctrinal. An Order Dialogus sister might use her linguistic skills to decipher a Xenos message, providing critical intelligence for an Imperial crusade. An Order Famulus sister embedded in a noble house can ensure that families' loyalty, directing their resources to support the Ministorum's goals. The Sororitas are not a single weapon, but a multi-tool of faith, each order fulfilling a specific function within the Church's grand design. The ultimate test of the Ministorum's practical application is the birth of the Great Rift and the creation of the Imperium Nihilus. With the Astronomicon's light obscured and direct communication from Terra severed, the Church on the far side of the rift was plunged into a doctrinal crisis. How does the faith function when it is cut off from the Sanctus Imperialis, the holy home of its God? The result has been fragmentation. While some worlds have maintained orthodox belief, others have devolved into radical isolationist cults. The cult of the Rift, for example, may see the Terran reality not as a catastrophe, but as a divine herald of the Emperor's final ascension. This demonstrates a core, practical truth about the Ministorum. Its unity is fragile. It is maintained by constant reinforcement from Terra, the Schola Progenium, and the battle fleet. When that reinforcement fails, the creed mutates. This is why the Ministorum is so violently opposed to any deviation. They are not just fighting for souls, they are fighting to maintain a single, unified psychological front against a universe that constantly seeks to break it. So, let us synthesize. The Adeptus Ministorum is not a passive entity. It is an active, applied instrument of state policy. Its doctrine provides a common identity and a reason for sacrifice to quadrillions of citizens living in hellish conditions. Its missionaries are cultural shock troops, assimilating new worlds and identifying threats. Its militant arm, the Sororitas, enforces doctrinal purity with extreme prejudice and serves as a politically safe military force for the ecclesiarchy. Its infrastructure, the priests, the confessors, the scholas, creates a self-perpetuating system of indoctrination and control that is parallel to and interwoven with the secular government. In a practical, real-world context within the 41st millennium, the Imperium could not function without the Ministorum. It is the psychological engine that makes the endless wars bearable, the bureaucratic terror acceptable, and the unimaginable sacrifices meaningful. It is the story that humanity tells itself to avoid going mad in a hostile universe. But as we have seen, that story can be corrupted, and that engine can be turned inward with catastrophic results. And so we reach the end of our deep dive. We have journeyed from the forbidden origins of the Imperial Creed to the brutal machinery of its modern form. Let us now take a final moment to reflect on what we have learned, and where this endless story of faith and fury might lead next. Our journey in summary. We began with the God who denied divinity, exploring the ultimate irony. The Imperial Cult was born from the heresy of worshipping the Emperor, a man who fought a crusade to eradicate religion. We built the pillars of power, understanding the vast structure of the Adeptus Ministorum, from the Ecclesiarch on Terra to the Missionaria Galaxia on the frontier, and the core dogmas that every citizen must believe. We witnessed the institution's nadir in the age of apostasy, where the corruption of absolute power in the hands of Goj Van Dyer led to the reign of blood, and was ultimately broken by the revelation that created the Sisters of Battle. And finally, we saw the living creed, how this faith is practically applied as a weapon for control, conquest, and survival in the brutal reality of the 41st millennium. The Adeptus Ministorum is the greatest paradox of the Imperium. It is the source of unity and the spark of civil war. It offers the only comfort in a life of agony, and it justifies the most horrific purges. It was forged in rebellion, refined in tyranny, and now stands as the unyielding heart of a dying empire. It is not a simple force for good or evil. It is the necessary, terrifying engine of faith that allows humanity to stare into the abyss of the warp, the Xenos, and its own soul, and not go entirely mad. But the story is never over. The galaxy continues to turn. The Great Rift has presented the greatest challenge to the Ministorum's unity since the age of apostasy itself. In the Imperium Nihilus, new creeds and dangerous messiahs are undoubtedly rising. The recent resurrection of the Primarch Robot Guilliman, a son of the atheist emperor, has created an unthinkable theological crisis. How does the Church reconcile a living son of their God, who himself openly questions the Imperial Creed? The next chapters of the Ministorum's history are being written now, in the fires of the Indomitus Crusade. Provide a clear, direct call to action and next steps for the viewer. If this deep dive has ignited your interest in the lore of the Imperium's darkest institution, there are always more paths to walk. To understand the Church's greatest enemies, a deep dive into the Ordo Hereticus of the Inquisition is essential. They are the Ministorum's shadowy partner in hunting internal corruption. The story of Sebastian Thor and the Confederation of Light we mentioned briefly is a fascinating counter-narrative to the Ecclesiarchy's dominance. And to truly understand the beginning, one must study the end of the Great Crusade and the Imperial truth in detail, to see the philosophy the Emperor fought and died for. The lore is vast. The battle for the soul of humanity never ends. Thank you for joining this exploration of the Adeptus Ministorum. Remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But for humanity there is also faith. And perhaps in the end they are the same thing. And again, thank you for watching. The Emperor protects.